right, fantastic. So again, thanks for having me today, and congratulations to all of you on this call. I applaud your efforts to learn more about administration and more about how to grow and develop a career from a career standpoint. It sounds like you've had a nice, well-balanced curriculum, and this is just another element of, how do we take massive amounts of data? How do we break things down? How do we make these things presentable so we can make our case for whatever it is we may be asking? It could be the hospital, it could be others within the organization, but how do we do this in a meaningful way? And also, how do we approach problem solving? So I think these things go hand in hand. So I'm going to kind of go through both of those buckets with you guys and show you some real examples of ways we've used data analytics to help inform decision making. So again, thanks for having me today. So when you think about issues organizations face in working with analytics, here's some typical problems that we've seen, right? So analysis might show great insights, but decision makers really can't understand all of the data, so we don't always make great decisions if there's not an understanding for the background behind the analytics and the data that we're analyzing. There's sometimes when you go to a meeting, I'm sure this has happened to you or some colleagues that you have, where you kind of get into a data standoff, if you will, right? So you bring your set of data and say, here's what the source of truth is, and somebody else says, no, that can't be right. Here's what the data should be. And then you spend the entire time arguing about what's true and what's not true from a data integrity standpoint. Oftentimes, as many of you are dealing with consistently, there's a lot of priorities. By the time analyses are complete, decisions already been made. So sometimes we spend too much time analyzing data without actually taking that to action. So people using the same or similar data but performing different analyses and arriving at different conclusions as to what the data tells them. I know at Vanderbilt, we've really tried to create a single source of truth. We've tried to create, these data elements need to be vetted by this group to make sure we're pulling the data consistently when different areas of the medical center present things. So we have a single source of truth, and we end up having, a repository where everything balances to zero from a ledger and a financial standpoint. Tools are so complicated or slow that no one uses them. I know my experience working with faculty, they're so busy and they're not necessarily here to analyze data and to look at things. So we want to make sure we try to make things as intuitive as possible, push things out as much as possible. These are very busy folks. So how do we make it easier for our faculty to access data? And, if we're trying to get to something that's perfect, we'll never get there, right? So it would be analysis paralysis. You probably have heard of that. I am always a big believer of 70, 75, 80% feeling pretty good about the data. And usually it's what we call directionally correct, which means it might not be perfect, but it's telling the story we want to tell, even though it may be off by a few dollars or something like that, right? But we can't spend we could spend all of our time just doing analysis. So another big issue facing it is senior leaders committed to the truth of analytics, right? So this was kind of a quote about data science as the CEOs. You can't handle the truth. I love that. If any of you know, data science is one of the hottest fields in healthcare. Some of the best paying jobs, very coveted, very high demand, at least in our institution. I'm not sure about all of yours, but great need for folks that are, first off, very bright, can pull the data, can analyze the data, and then can present it in a meaningful way and answer questions and be able to have intelligent conversations of making possible recommendations of what the data is showing. So really, really hot field. But a lot of times people don't really want to know what the true answer may be. So it's kind of overcoming that a little bit in many, many places. So kind of what we've done at Vanderbilt is we've set up a enterprise analytics team, and it's a group where they manage the data warehouse. They serve as our source of truth. They are the ones who we go to that has been validated by all of our senior executives. So when we're presenting data, we say, yeah, we ran this past our analytics group. They've done the due diligence, done the analysis, and have set this up. So when you think about it, we kind of organize it into three levers, right? So we have structure, right? So we make sure we have the right people within the organization that have access to the data to help us make decisions. So processes, enabling a repeatable process to solve similar questions using similar methods, creating a single source of truth. Like we've done that for length of stay as an example. So many people would come to meetings and bring their own length of stay data. So we created one, again, source of truth that tracks resource length of stay by area, by doctor, by unit, however you want to look at it. But that is what we use as our source of truth. And then creating tools. We're a big, Tableau shop here at Vanderbilt. You guys might use Tableau or other things at your current locations and facilities as well. We use it a ton. It's nice. It's graphical. It's relatively easy to navigate, shows graphs and things to easily kind of show the picture that you want to look at there. So when you think about ways we can help drive decision-making, right? So you need to have a supportive culture. So it's not just enough to implement analytics, but want to make sure that everybody feels good that we are all working together for the common good to try to make decisions based on data-driven and not what our gut tells us. It's funny if you talk to data scientists and you hear people say, well, my gut tells me this, I think they cringe because they like to understand what the data shows as much as possible versus what our gut is telling us, right? So you've got to have a culture that really wants to use data to help drive decisions. Again, we've already kind of talked a little bit about single source of truth. So all analyses are run by the same team and group of people. So they validate it. So when we present it, we can say, if you will, it's got the stamp of approval of our analytics folks associated with that. Importance of framing. So extremely important to create an analytics process and follow-up that also processes things consistently, right? So we make sure that we frame these exercises in the same way. We've been trying to become more of a lean organization. We use some of the lean tools. I'll show you a couple examples of that if you haven't seen those before, like an A3 as an example. So putting together similar documents that we're all using from a similar standpoint with that. And then again, we have a team of folks that all work collectively up under one executive leader who provides oversight for all of the data warehouse and all the mining. And again, we have a consistent, cohesive group that's all approaching things, pulling data and extracting it in a similar fashion. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about problem-solving framework. I love this quote. If I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and 5 minutes thinking about the solutions. I love the picture of Einstein. I think that's just fantastic. So I am very guilty of not doing this. Maybe many of you are too. Someone comes to us and says, hey, I've got this problem. What is our immediate thing we want to start doing? We want to start trying to solve the solution. Have you thought about this? What about this? What about that? Versus really probing and asking good questions to make sure we're solving the right problem. I'll have faculty come to me at times and they're really upset about their pay and they're not paid enough as an example. And in reality, when I start asking a number of questions, it's really not about pay, it's about something else. So over my career, I have solved many problems that were the wrong problems to solve. So we really try to take a little bit more of take a step back approach and ask really good questions to make sure we are solving the correct problem. So if you think about our typical way we go about problem solving, this has been the traditional way, right? We go ahead and we pull a bunch of data together. Here's what the data tells us. Here's what we should do with that. And here's where we need to go next, right? That is our typical way that we solve problems. Again, do this many times, have done it many times in the past. But if you think about it, there's a better way to do it. And there's a little bit more of an efficient and more iterative approach to it. So if you think about it, if we spend more time on the front end really defining the problem, then we're going to do a better job really probably pulling the data. We're going to do a better job of analyzing the issues. Then we can develop a hypothesis. Then we start gathering and analyzing all of the data, right? And then conclude and recommend. But you can see the arrows going back. Sometimes we will analyze an issue and then we'll develop a hypothesis. Well, that might change. Then we go back and we change the definition of the problem, right? So you can see it's a very iterative process. So we kind of really work hard to define the problem, make sure we have the right problem. And then once we've gone through all these different iterations of scenarios, asking good questions, doing analysis, then we get to the end of conclusions and recommendations, right? So again, much more efficient to spend enough time understanding what's truly the problem. So here's a way of kind of thinking about problem solving. This is called the focus framework. You can kind of see what this looks like. So focus stands for frame, right? So identifying key questions, making sure we are drawing up the right context. How do we organize our thoughts around this? Collecting, data, asking good questions, understanding, and then synthesizing the data, right? So that's really at the end of the day, we want to be able to take all this information, look at all this analysis, and then break it down and synthesize it so that our end users understand what it is we're trying to say with the data, or what we think the data might be indicating to us, and how do we frame that up, right? So if you think about data analyst, there's a lot of titles that you see, right? What that means, data analyst means they don't just pull data, they analyze the data. What is analyzing data? It's helping synthesize the data, right? So taking all of this data, synthesizing it to say, here's what we think it means, here's what we think we should do after all the different iterations of working to solve the problems. Okay, so then also you think about the focus strategy too. Here are kind of our rules of engagement, right? So when we go back to our very first initial thing of focus about the framing of it all, we want to make sure that we're asking the key questions to drive the project. There's a lot of great books and things written about asking questions. And some of the best leaders I've ever worked with always ask great questions. You're in a meeting, you're like, wow, what a great question. I don't really know the answer, or very thought-provoking, right? So the better you are at asking questions and being able to probe others to kind of think through things, typically the better results you're going to get, because hopefully you're going to kind of go through the different scenarios and different roads associated with that. So after we kind of frame things up, we want to organize our thoughts, right? We kind of develop a hypothesis, right? And hypothesis is, this is what I think might be the case. So we're going to propose that this might be the answer, and then let's go pull the data and look and see whether or not that's the case, right? So you develop other supporting hypotheses, and you continue to revisit and revise. This is that whole iterative process and reiterative process that I showed you a few minutes ago, when you're going back and back until you get the right problem, you get the right hypothesis, and you kind of run through, test it, and come to an end result, right? So then after you're organizing, you start collection, right? So you want to look at the different types of analysis and related data to kind of get to the end associated with that. You want to be able to understand. I love so what. So, anytime you're doing any kind of analysis or solving a problem, you want to make sure it's very clear to the others why it's a big deal. What's your 1 minute story of the reason why this is critical and this is important for us to better understand. And then at the end of the day, we want to be able to tell the story of what we think the data shows, what we think we can do to make things better, and make that so it's very clear, very concise, and very succinct. So if you're working in a lean organization now, or if you've studied lean concepts, you probably are familiar with this, similar to like an A3 kind of format. You can kind of see this is the question, or at the top our problem statement, either way on that. What do you think it might be? What's some of the background? What's the context? What would be success if we could get it? If we could get an end result, what's the scope? What are some challenges you might have in trying to get to the end? Who needs to be involved in the decision making, and what are our barriers? So again, you guys maybe have seen this from a A3 construct. So this is an example of an issue tree template. So this is kind of what we use when we are trying to map out ways to go across and figure out what the issues may be, and kind of working through that whole problem solving analysis that I showed you guys a second ago. By the way, if anybody has any questions, I'm not sure, Travis, how we're doing this, but feel free to either ask the question, or you can raise your hand, put a chat, and we can get to those at the end, but I'm happy to entertain those as we go too, if that's how you guys have been playing.
Yeah, if anyone has a question, feel free to type in, or else we can use the chat function.
Right. Okay, so here's an example of an issue tree. So there's I think it was a Harvard Business Review case where there was Blue Cross Insurance, I think it was out of Pennsylvania, that was trying to make a determination. There was a hospital there that, there was a few hospitals kind of in this specific network. And the question, or what was posed to Blue Cross was they needed a little bit of money to help bail out the hospital. So they needed some better rates and things to kind of keep the hospital afloat, which would maintain competition in the market, right? Which, you know, most insurance companies like. It kind of keeps people a little bit honest. Nobody can, you know, restrict rates and drive up prices and things like that. So the Blue Crosses of Pennsylvania, I believe, was the background here. It gone to Blue Cross to ask, hey, you know, would you guys be willing to kind of help us kind of work through these financial hardships that we're having, right? So here's kind of an example that was worked through and part of one of our training teams we do at Vanderbilt. So kind of what should Blue do, right? So here's the big, long, you know, scenario of what the case study is. And then here's some different pieces associated with kind of working through the decision-making process associated with that. So when you think about what are the options that Blue Cross Blue Shield may have as far as the ask goes, and then you have do nothing would be one, continuing giving money to the medical center as needed, or they can even merge or buy the medical center. So those were kind of like different options associated with that one particular question, right? What are financial implications? Higher prices, risk of not turning the medical center around. They could put a bunch of money in, it might go belly up and they've lost a bunch of money. How it looks for their debt structure. I'm not going to read through all of this, but you can kind of see how this kind of stratifies going across. And oftentimes if you sit down and you put things on a piece of paper, I don't know if you guys have ever done like value mapping, things of that nature. A lot of times if you'll put things and kind of map it through, you'll be amazed at how much clarity that can bring, how much waste you might be able to identify if you're mapping through a process. But this is just another way to put things on a piece of paper to try to understand solving problems and working through the various issues to get to some conclusions, right? So then if you kind of go up to the very top again, so what are Blue's options? You can see these are some different scenarios. And then if these scenarios were done, here are some of the conclusions that might happen if these decisions are made, right? So again, kind of working through that whole decision-making flow chart, if you will, to kind of come up with conclusions, right? Does not always solve, can control future, always an option. So again, I'm not going to read through all of these different examples, just trying to show you when you're thinking about solving a problem, you want to map it all out, put down the different options, work your way out and get to the very end, and then kind of see using data, you know, what might be the most viable option for you associated with your specific problem. So again, this would be kind of similar to what we showed the graph before, or the PowerPoint slide before. This would be just kind of drafting the hypothesis structure to help guide analysis. So this is just a way for you to put kind of in summary form the problem statement, a couple scenarios, what might happen as you're looking through things. And then what happens with this usually is you go through as you test the data and understand what the data is showing or telling us, then you can start eliminating some of these different hypotheses and structures along the way till you kind of get to the end synthesis where you're actually making the recommendations associated with that. So here'd be an example back to the Blue Cross example we mentioned a second ago. So if we decided that Blue should merge with medical center, here are the different things that would be considered associated with that. It would create a long-term solution for the medical center. The community would view this as a very favorable option, and it would ensure continued ensured continued competition to keep consumer prices down. So when they kind of went through the whole decision-making process and said, based on what we know, pulling the data, working through the decision tree, we think this might be the best answer. And if we do that, these are the three things we think can come from that based on looking at the data and doing the analysis, right? So here's a way to kind of structure out hypothesis and kind of working that through in a specific way. So this is a really busy graph and just kind of hit the highlights associated with this. This again is just another way to kind of think about how do we take key elements of the work plan and organize these, right? We want to build our fact base, we want to do the analysis, and then we want to make recommendations. This is just the activities and deliverables and things that are kind of mapped out during the entire problem solving event that you're going to eventually get to associated with that. So the elements of the detailed work plan, this is how it would kind of shake out. Again, what are the issues? What are the problem statements, again, that we've spent time reiterating until we really have defined what that looks like. What is our hypothesis, right? This is what we think the likely resolution of the issue may be. And this is the reason why it's going to, you know, answering the question yes or no. Then we conduct the analysis, try to understand what different models to explore to prove or disprove our hypothesis. Source kind of runs through, helps identify the likely location or means of obtaining data to undertake analysis. Then the responsibility identifies the person who will obtain the data and undertake the analysis. And then the end product is what we think, based on everything we've done, everything we've been able to analyze, this is what we think will be the end product or the synthesis of all of the data and things we have pulled together from a decision making standpoint. Again, just another way to kind of organize the data and kind of walking this across. Again, it's great to be able to display these things in very concise, succinct way, so you can kind of see what the support is, what kind of analysis took place, what was the source of how we did the analysis, who's responsible, and then what's the timeline to kind of get it done so we can keep the project moving on time. And the understanding kind of the storyline was very interesting about, and this kind of gets a little bit into giving an effective presentation, which is another great possible lecture if you guys have not had anything along those lines. But oftentimes we will spend a lot of time putting together a presentation for executives or for others. And we run through all of the background and all of the things that are happening. And then we have 1 minute left before the meeting's over. And then we start telling people what we found, what we need, what we want, right? So this would encourage you to think about that at the very beginning of your presentation, right? From when you're telling your story. That's what the executive overview would be. So what we would do at Vanderbilt is once we've gone through this whole analysis, and by the way, most executives don't really care about how you did the analysis. I would recommend if you're putting one together, put all that part in the appendix. You know, I've had CEOs tell me, it's like, you know, not that interested in all the work you did. And you did a lot of work and you spent a lot of time. I think that's great. I really want to understand what you're asking or what your recommendation is, much more so than all of the analysis. And again, put that in the back, put that in the appendix if they want to get into it and say, how did you come up with this? We'll look at appendix, 2, page 8, and here's how we did the calculation kind of thing, right? So start with the executive overview, really. So kind of start with the end in mind, right? This is what we found. This was our problem, and this is what we found. So you want to make sure that we do a really nice job in framing that up in the beginning. And then you want to kind of go through and build your case after you've said what you need. Then you go back and say, okay, here's what we need, and here's how we came up with that, right? So sometimes that's a little bit contrary to how people think of things. Again, I've been guilty of this as well. Go through and tell our story, then ask at the end versus here's what we need, here's what we found, and let me tell you kind of how we got there, right? So executive overview, high level, 30,000-foot view of what you found, what you know, and the salient points you want to make sure that you get across. We kind of go through and talk about the main recommendations, kind of the governance, the thoughts around what we found. We want to make sure we go through the different topics that kind of helped you come to the end result. You want to kind of break things down and however many main points you have. You want to keep it very clean, very clear, and very concise. Again, when you put together slides, you don't want to put together these massive busy slides and all of this stuff that's confusing. You want to put a header at the top that's very clear, very easy to understand, and then a little bit of stuff in the body that shows the background of how you came up with your summary statement at the top. Put your main point, supporting slide or two, another main point, supporting slide, main point, and then again, your conclusion, which should be very similar to where you started at the very beginning, right? It's almost like a reiteration of, so in conclusion, I want to make sure we reframe what we said in the very beginning about here's what we came up with from a decision-making standpoint. Here are the results that we came up with. Here's what we're asking for. Again, very clear, very succinct, very concise. Okay, this is just another kind of a storyline logic map. And again, I'm going to pass along these slides. You guys will have a copy of these if this is interest to you down the road. So again, you can use whatever tools work for you. These are just some tools we happen to use here at Vanderbilt and kind of working through a logical way of drawing things out and doing that. So I won't spend much more time on this, but just a way to visually kind of look at things. So when you think about what are some best practices in gathering data, problem solving, synthesizing, and making recommendations, we want to make sure that we talk, right? Communications constantly. I teach a couple classes at Lipscomb University here in Nashville, and I use the analogy a lot that communication is kind of similar to the rebounding of basketball. So I don't know how many sports fans we might have on this call this afternoon, but if you think about basketball, if you're a basketball player, can you shoot the ball too much? Absolutely. You dribble down the court, you shoot every time. Why didn't you pass to Johnny under the basket? He was wide open. So you can shoot too much, right? Can you pass too much in basketball? Absolutely, 100%. Why'd you pass the ball? You were wide open. You should have taken the shot. Don't pass, shoot the ball, right? Pass too much, you can shoot too much. You really can't rebound too much, right? Nobody ever says, hey, you know, you had 15 rebounds last night. Let's try to cut back on that today, right? Try not to rebound too much. I look at that like communication. I've rarely had a situation where I got feedback that said, wow, Mack, you really over-communicated about that, or we knew too much about this project, or I wish you wouldn't tell me as much, right? Rarely get that feedback, right? So really talking and communicating is really, really, really important. And the ability to listen attentively is great too. I took a facilitation class, and I got 2 pieces of advice from a facilitation standpoint that I think are absolutely spot on and fantastic. And I'm going to share those with you free of charge, no extra cost of admission. So I think these are great. Tell me what you think. The first one is this. When you're talking and you're in a meeting and you're presenting things, ask yourself, why am I talking? Right? Some of us talk more than we probably should. If you're talking and you're presenting and you're making your point, wonderful. But if you're continuing to talk and talk and talk, you can oftentimes undo some of the positive things. So ask yourself when you're presenting information and you're making a case or doing something that, why am I talking? Okay, that's a great piece of advice I learned from this facilitator who's spectacular and nationally well-known as a great facilitator based out of Oregon. Second thing is when we think about listen attentively, here's another great thing to think about from a facilitation standpoint. And that's our job as administrators and those who are aspiring to be administrators is I spend a lot of time facilitating discussions, facilitating problem solving, right? Helping others come to their own conclusions as much as possible, asking good questions, provoking ideas, talking through things to help people make up, hopefully, again, their own decision. So the second piece of facilitation advice I'd love to give you that I think is great is this. Speak as if you're right. Listen as if you're wrong. I'm not great at that, but that is a wonderful way to listen attentively and to really pay attention to what others think, right? So speak as if you're correct and listen as if you're wrong. Great way to facilitate, great way to have good communication and good strategies associated with that. Separate issues from people. Try not to take things personally. Make sure if you're arguing and discussing a point, you're discussing the issue and not the person associated with the issue. Make sure you keep those things separately. You're going to be able to evaluate your group dynamics. Make sure you have a healthy culture, that you have a safe place to have candid conversations, set expectations, monitor results, develop and reevaluate your plan. We want to make sure we leverage expertise. Again, I am not the data analytics person at Vanderbilt. I am the administrator for emergency medicine. We have very good analytics people that are great at pulling the data and helping us understand the data. So I don't try to go to the data warehouse. I don't try to extract my own data. I let the experts do that. And then my job is to help us pull it all together and how do we tell our story for the recommendations. And again, I'm going to show you an example of that in a second. Keep people accountable. You saw a few slides back where we actually had that accountability grid. There's different ways to do that. There's a thing called a RACI, who's responsible, who's accountable, who has control, and who is there to inform, I think is what RACI stands for. But again, it's a matrix to make sure everybody who understands what the role is and getting to the end result for this specific project. And then motivation, right? Identify unique motivators, positively reinforce your teammates, and celebrate achievements. I read something great the other day. Oftentimes, we get overwhelmed if we look at where we're trying to get to, if we have this like audacious goal or this very challenging thing. So you want to make sure that you celebrate the small wins along the way to keep momentum and keep people engaged and keep people excited about the work. All right, so that's kind of enough of the theory, but I thought that's really good because I wanted to give you kind of a frame of reference of when we're thinking about solving problems at Vanderbilt and using data, we try to use those tools I have shared with you. We want to make sure that we go through some kind of uniformity when we pull things and approach problem solving and decision making in a similar way. So I'm going to show you a couple of examples of things, how we use data in emergency medicine to move things forward and to make our case. Okay, so we did this a couple years ago, and I'm sure many of you that work in operations in your local ED, especially if you're in a large academic medical center area, probably deal with a lot of psychiatric patients in the ED that obviously our ED doctors aren't necessarily trained to handle, right? I mean, they're not trained for a lot of the behavioral health issues and things that patients that show up. So we've identified for years that we had a real problem with psychiatric patients boarding in our ED here at Vanderbilt. And we wanted to, so instead of just going into our executives and go, oh, we got this boarding problem, we need you to solve it for us. We wanted to get to a very methodical, and I'll show it to you in a second, methodical way of pulling the data, analyzing the data, showing an ROI, what we think if you invest $1, here's what the return on investment is going to be, and all of that robust thing. But we wanted to paint a very clear picture to our executives. It was easy to understand with metrics and things associated with investing in this for the good of our patients and for the good of ED. So here's the exact slides that we use. I wanted to pull and show you our exact presentation that we put together in fiscal year 18 based on our previous couple of years worth of data, right? So growing psychiatric patient volume that cannot be properly evaluated in ED has led to an increased length of stay. So I imagine those of you who are part of big organizations probably have boarding challenges. So we benchmark our data, wonderfully well with our roundtable analytics folks who help us aggregate all of our information together and look at how well we do compared to our peers. If you look at the boarding data that gets sent in for all the academic medical centers, we're like at the top of the heap, and that's the top of the heap in not a good way, right? So we've had a big boarding challenge for years and years and years. It just continues to be prolonged. So we thought this is, and it's very high on the list of priorities, right? Getting length of stay reduced, get patients out, get patients upstairs. All of these things are obviously very interrelated. So we wanted to make sure that, that's a big topic for Vanderbilt for improvement. So we want to make sure we can frame that up appropriately. So we pulled together some very specific data elements, right? So we showed our psych patient volume increased 21% in fiscal year 17 and over 68% over the past couple of fiscal years. And for fiscal year 17, we show our length of stay increased by 87%. Our volume is expected to continue rising. Nashville is a hot, hot city. Everybody wants to move to Nashville, it seems like. A lot of companies are relocating here. We are busting at the seams from a population growth standpoint. 1 in 8 ED patients nationwide has a mental health or substance abuse problem, so we pulled some literature to back up our case as well. And then at the bottom, we're showing our graphical representation, right? Very simple graphs, very easy to read, very easy to understand. We are showing a growth in our average length of stay in the ED with our psychiatric patient volume. So you can read my title at the top. A growing psychiatric patient volume cannot be properly evaluated has increased our length of stay. You can look at these two graphs in 5 seconds, know exactly what the story of this slide is. Again, really concise, to the point, succinct. This is actually kind of the McKinsey way of presenting information. You guys are probably familiar with McKinsey & Company, world-renowned consulting group. Our person who runs our analytics at Vanderbilt came from McKinsey, very smart guy. And he helped bring this kind of presentation skill and all that. We've taught this to many people too. But anyway, so very concise, very clean. If you didn't come to this meeting, I could send you my slides. You know exactly what the meeting was. And that's the purpose of an effective slide with effective titles at the top to really tell the picture. Graphs and things are great too. And you want to make sure you use 0 axes on both of these. Otherwise, you could kind of skew the curves. Great book written in the 50s called How to Lie with Statistics. We don't want to do that, where you manipulate a graph and it looks like it's growing like this, but your scale is kind of out of whack. So it's important to start with 0 on both sides. You can really see what the growth curve looks like associated with that. So again, a title, very simple: boarding psych patients in ED increase costs and decrease revenues. It's opportunity costs, right? So if we don't have enough space and enough room and enough beds, then our left without being seen is leaving. And we did an analysis, I think it was part of this project here, where we actually found that, and maybe similar to your organizations too, that you would think, oh, left without being seen are all your less acuity patients. Well, for the most part, that's true. But about a third of our patients who left without being seen could have potentially been admitted to the hospital. So it's not always as clean cut as that. So that's true opportunity costs and lost revenues when we have a boarding problem. So here's an example. Thought it was good to show real examples, real dollars, real scenarios to kind of tell, again, we're telling our story, right? So on Monday, July 17th at 8 a.m., we had 16 PAS patients. That's our psych patients. They had been boarding for 190 hours. So not only are they boarding and taking up space, and we just mentioned the opportunity costs of others having to leave, but we're also having to pay people to sit there with them, right? Because we don't have the staff or the people to kind of keep an eye and make sure that they're okay and are, you know, being safe and appropriate. So an average of 10 to 20 bucks an hour, 12 sitters. So you can see what we're spending on hour on sitter costs. 8 ED beds were occupied. This was our potential bed hour loss of contribution margin. Again, we took the high level. This is what we found. This is the number. If you want to see how we did the math, it's in the appendix, right? Otherwise, you could spend 45 minutes arguing whether you did it right or what have you. But again, validated with our analytic group, source of truth, calculations later on if you guys want to look at that, or we could talk more about that, right? So put that in the back. And then 31 patients left without being seen. Other impacts include lost efficiencies in room cleaning, stocking, ECGs, transport, patient care, increasing waiting room times for patients with acute issues that need to be in, and then just making it really challenging in the way. So I know this, you can't really read this slide. It's just an example of, again, we want to be able to easily show the picture, tell the story. People don't know what all this means, but if you look at red and you see the areas that we've graphed here, is not good. Those are people that have been boarding, and it's easy to look at this and see your picture and go, wow, that is a big issue. Again, another graphical display of it. So here's our hypothesis. So we said, you know what, if we had an ED psychiatrist, we could eliminate 49 psych patient bed hours every week. And again, we did the math, and it's all back in the appendix and put it together. Finance blessed, analytics blessed. It felt really good. But again, it was reasonable, not perfect, but directionally correct, pretty close to what we felt like was reality. And we have costing software, APSI data that we use, so we felt like we had a pretty good, be able to tell the story pretty well associated with that. So here's kind of what the math, here's how we did it. So the reduction in boarded hours generates open ED bed hours for patients with acute issues and transfers, while also decreasing the need for sitters, right? So free up our beds, decrease our sitter costs, and not have to divert transfers and things that need to come to a Vanderbilt tertiary quaternary care center. They're also very oftentimes high margin patients, good business and things that sometimes if we're on diversion, having to turn away because we're full with patients that are a little bit, you know, less than desirable for the appropriateness of being in the ED. So we put our assumption at the bottom that within 3 to 5 hours, the psychiatrist will be able to see and discharge or transfer those patients that have normally left the ED or been transferred but not admitted, right? We worked with our psychiatry colleagues. I think I had that on the very beginning slide. We met with psychiatry, the chair, and others getting involved to help put together this analysis, so we all felt good. that we could deliver and what we were proposing. Very important to kind of build that collaboration on the front end. So here's kind of what we came up with when we did the math. So we said these available bed hours could generate contribution margin of $816,000. I imagine you guys know this. Some of you, I'm sure, work in finance. I'm sure you've had a finance class with this, but I'll reiterate if you'd like to know. Contribution margin is simply revenues minus direct expenses is contribution margin before overhead, right? So I brought in $1. It directly cost me 50 cents to do that work, to bring that dollar in. We made 50 cents in contribution margin on that singular activity, okay, before infrastructure and overhead and all that stuff. So then we just kind of did the math, and we showed, you know, down here, again, I think very easy to read, very clean going across, annual contribution margin from eliminated psych hours, Mondays through Thursday. That was our busiest time where we had psych patients. We weren't going to do Friday, Saturday, or Sunday. And then we kind of walked through and said, here's what we think, here's how much we think we could save by each day, totaling $816,000. And again, we had this in the appendix if you want to see the detail on how we pulled this information together. And the assumption at the bottom that they were going to work 15 shifts each month, and therefore only 3 out of 4 Thursdays. So you can see Thursday we cut back a little bit on the contribution margin, understanding that we wouldn't be able to cover every single Thursday, but we wanted to at least start with 15 a month and see how it goes. So that's kind of the background, and that's kind of the math of what we pitched. And then we also said that we also felt like there'd be additional revenue opportunities with these services. So of these psychiatric patients coming in, 18% were currently discharged from the adult ED without billing a CPT code. So we were leaving some money on the table from a billing opportunity. An adult ED psychiatrist would be able to drop this charge. Given the payer mix, we expect collections, $42 per bill, resulting in another $19,000 in incremental revenue, right? So the previous slide we showed, we think by decreasing hours and emptying out some of the ED and the ability to see more patients and have less boarding, that we can contribute over $800,000 in contribution margin. And then this is an incremental, it's not a ton of money, but $19,000 also very conservatively. All this stuff is very conservative, by the way, very much a believer in better to, you know, under promise and over deliver. You know, if you're trying to understand what your projections may be, definitely better to be conservative. So again, not a gazillion dollars, but, you know, another $19,000 we felt was very reasonable from a new charge capture standpoint. So here's a really, again, basic funds flow request. It's what we kind of call it here at Vanderbilt when we go to our leadership and say, hey, would you be interested in investing in this project for us? So really simple math, really simple format, easy to understand. We showed our $19,000 in collections, right? That's what our incremental revenue we felt like was going to be. Our tax rate at Vanderbilt is 15.25%, so it would come 16,000 of the 19 would come into the department. We put in what we projected our salary to be, our fringe benefit rate, what our malpractice CME, equipment supplies, total expenses. So you can see 254 minus 16 is a negative 237,000. So that's our ask. And at the very top, you can see that very clear. We're asking $237,000 in funding for this venture. Here's the math. And then we said, if you invest the $200,000, here's where we think your ROI will be, right? So again, we're trying to show value of doing this for the good of our patients and also for the good of our financial viability as well. So what we did was we said, you know, is again, we had the contribution margin, $800,000 that we had previously, $19,000 in increased collections. If you invest $250,000, we feel like you can get more than a 2-for-$1 back on your investment. And I don't know what you guys look at your institution, but that's usually the number that our executives like to see, that if we get them to invest $1, that eventually they'll get $2 back. So pretty much a 2-to-1 ratio is what we hope to achieve. So then we also said, well, let's create some metrics. So this is how we'll evaluate how well we've done, right? So we can look at our current state, where the current state is and what would be success. So evaluation charges in the ED, we're doing 0 now. Can we do some in the future? 6 hours. ED psych patient in adult ED bed of about 6.1 hours was the current run rate. Number of diversions of time, 204. Press gaining, see our top box scores, and our left without being seen. Right? These are the metrics we'd like to track. We feel like if we can make improvements in these, then we've had success in our program, right? Very quantitative ways to measure that. So this is just a way we kind of helped come up with the contribution margin for ED visit and the appendix. Again, we didn't get in all this because it's a lot of information, but if somebody wanted to quickly say, can somebody walk me through and tell me how you came up with what you came up with? We can go to the back of the deck after we presented. Yeah, please refer to appendix page 35 and let us walk you through how we did the math associated with this. Again, how we came up with the average collection per visit, payer mix, all of that stuff. Again, in the appendix, we didn't get into this unless someone had a question. All right. So that's one project we did. We had success. We presented that to our executive leaders. They were impressed with the data we pulled. They felt good about the investment. They invested in that, and it's been a very successful program. We have been able to decrease some of that length of stay associated with our psych patients. Okay, so I'm going to run through this, and I'm going to have a few more minutes, but let me walk through this with you as well. So one of the things we recognized here at Vanderbilt is we weren't doing a very good job of capturing the orthopedic procedures that are taking place in the ED. And we're still not doing a great job, but we're doing a better job. And we wanted to figure out what's a way we could focus on working with our faculty to better capture this work so we can do a billable activity. The work was taking place. An ortho resident or someone was coming in and doing the work, but if we didn't have an attending present, we weren't able to drop a charge. It wasn't supervised and that type of thing. So again, how do we make this case? Again, these are all things to support our faculty, support our leadership to help us make decisions. So we came up with this dashboard. Gary Clark is our analytics guy who helped put this whole thing together, built the Tableau and everything. So here's kind of our summary, right? The Ortho Bilings Dashboard provides insights on how well we are capturing ortho procedures performed in the adult emergency department. What's our methodology? We came up with what might be from an ICD-10 standpoint, if they had these types of procedures, or these types of diagnoses, there should be a decent probability that there's a procedure. We were trying to calculate a percentage of capture, right? So we figured out any diagnosis with a fracture or dislocation. We wanted to look at those, identified and counter-sleep an orthopedic procedure took place, if there was a CPT code already billed, and then what was the gap between what was billed and what wasn't. That's our opportunity, obviously. And then continuous iteration and reiteration. But we wanted a starting point, and then we continue to tweak it and kind of work through it as we go. So again, we got up and showed this at a faculty meeting. So we showed it's very customizable. You can pull it by doctor. You can see here, you can do month of service. You can pull all these different elements, these drop-down choices to make decisions about pulling the data that you want to see that makes the most sense. So they can drill down very specifically to look at, I worked yesterday, let me pull that up. Our billing is done centrally. I'm not sure about your areas. We have coders that come code all of our ED visits for us. And so we could get back a week later and go, okay, I was there on Monday. I want to see whether or not those procedure codes got picked up, for ortho, and you look and see and match things up. And anyway, so there's a way to sort all of this and kind of exercise with this. So we kind of showed them how to go through, how to look at that. You can see the CPT codes, the diagnosis associated with that. And you can actually drill this down to the encounter level, as I said. So I was here on Monday. I saw 20 patients, and I know 10 of those did ortho procedure. I can click on those 10 to see whether or not those things got matched up, to see what might be missing and what was there and what's the opportunity. So again, very specific, very granular. And then if you looked at the entire board, you can pull it up and set it. So I can pull my information up. It just shows me my information. So we weren't like showing everybody everybody's stuff. We didn't want to embarrass anybody or do anything at all like that. We would show them their percentage of ortho capture as compared to everybody else, de-identified just from a percentage standpoint, but just gave each individual access to their own individual billing data. So then again, we can kind of see at the very top, we showed how many ortho CPT codes got billed. So we billed 1,000, but we had 4,800 diagnoses that could have, doesn't mean it always will happen, but could have an orthopedic procedure performed in the ED. So that's really kind of our baseline. So we started this for about 21% of diagnoses that oftentimes would result in an orthopedic procedure. We were actually billing those about 21% of the time. So that was our individual number. And you can see the percentages underneath the 20 are individual providers, right? And again, they know this, they know what their number is, and they know what it is compared to the rest. They want to be able to show in a graphical way how well we're doing. So to the left, upper left, you can see kind of this kind of a line chart. And eventually you'd like to see that kind of going up, obviously over time, but kind of choppy here, just kind of as we're going through and defining that information. But again, graphically display, busy people, show me the bottom line, show me the so what, am I getting better, am I not? How do I look at this at a glance? So trying to create views and things to make it easier on our faculty. All right, so in summary, the key to decision making is understanding the true problem and then building our case. I've showed you a couple ways to think about framing the problem, thinking about spending a lot of time understanding the problem before you go on to the other things, and feel comfortable going back if you created the wrong problem. Reiterate until you get the right problem, then you pull the data, and then you get hopefully the right answer to solve the right problem, right? So when you're thinking about solving a problem or using data analytics, think about the end in mind. So the orthopedic dashboard I just showed you. The end in mind was simply this. We don't think we're doing a very good job in capturing orthopedic procedures. What are things we could do to help create a way for our faculty to help partner with us to understand where we stand on that, how well we're doing, okay? That was the end in mind. We knew what we wanted to accomplish. Then we went out and developed a dashboard, and we tweaked it, and changed it multiple times, right? So you want to create the executive summary to list the things that you're requesting and build your case, as we talked about. When you're doing a presentation and you're using this form to ask for things and to make your story and tell it, start at the very beginning and tell what it is you found, what you need, and then go through and build your case that kind of backs up what you need. Make sure there's a single source of truth and the data is validated. If I go to a meeting presenting anything at all, I make sure to say that the information has been validated by finance or by analytics. I didn't just pull this out of the air, and that gives a sense of relief to our CFO, our executive leaders, that I didn't just make something up. It's been validated. So there's a lot more to data analysis and analytics than just pulling a bunch of data, as we've already talked about. We want to make sure we can organize it and present it in a very understandable way. Obviously, our doctors and executives are very smart people, but they don't understand our business of emergency medicine as much as we do. So we need to kind of help educate them as much as we can and break things down as simply as we can to tell the story, right? And again, make sure that you're solving the right problem. I have solved a lot of wrong problems in my career. So spend enough time understanding the problem. And once you really get the problem, then start pulling your data. And again, keep going back, iterative, reiterative as you go, right? And then the last thing is when you're presenting information, you want to make sure you do it in a succinct and clear manner, right? Very easy to understand. I should be able to send you my slides. You should be able to read my taglines and understand exactly what the story was without having to sit in that meeting. So be pithy, to the point, be succinct, and make sure it's clear.